In the fall of 2020, a rapper in Los Angeles released a music video.
I can just file a claim, rest coming straight to the bank. I'm doing shit that you can't, nigga, I'm smarter than you ain't. EDD scale, this thing that you heard about.
That's not a character he's playing. Fontrell Antonio Baines, stage name Nuke Bizzle, was describing his actual business. Unemployment debit cards, mailed by the state of California, in other people's names, to addresses he controlled. He collected more than $700,000, money loaded onto cards meant for laid-off waitresses and warehouse workers. And then he did something investigators couldn't quite believe. He put it in a song. On YouTube, with his face in frame. Federal prosecutors didn't need an informant, they pressed play. When he was finally arrested, he had unemployment cards in other people's names and a pistol he wasn't allowed to own. He pleaded guilty to both. Here's the thing you need to understand about the story you're about to watch. He wasn't a mastermind. He didn't hack anything. He filled out forms, and the forms believed him. Because in the spring of 2020, the United States government built something it had never built before. The fastest money pipe in its history. $1.2 trillion out the door at wire speed. And by most estimates, it became the largest theft of taxpayer money in American history. Not because the thieves were brilliant, because nobody checked. March 2020, the economy stops mid-stride. Within 6 weeks, more than 30 million Americans file for unemployment. Congress does something it almost never does. It moves fast. The CARES Act, roughly $2 trillion, goes from draft to the president's desk in a matter of days. Inside it, the Paycheck Protection Program. The idea is genuinely good. Small businesses get loans to keep paying workers, keep your people employed, and the loan is forgiven. Free money, but for a reason. The problem wasn't the idea, it was the physics. To save businesses dying by the day, the money had to move faster than any government program had ever moved. Self-certification. You attested, under penalty of perjury, that your business was real, your payroll was real, your need was real. The application asked, you answered. The wire went out. Understand what was removed to make that possible. A normal government-backed business loan is an interrogation, tax transcripts, bank statements, collateral, weeks of underwriting, a human being whose job is to say no. In the spring of 2020, nearly all of it was waived, deliberately. Every day of checking was a day of payrolls dying. Speed wasn't a flaw in the program. Speed was the program. And the program didn't come once. PPP ran in waves, tranche after tranche, hundreds of billions at a time, the rules loosening as Washington raced to push money out faster than the economy could collapse. The banks processing these loans earned fees on every loan they pushed through, and the government guaranteed 100% of the risk anyway. Read that sentence again, because it's the whole heist in one design decision. The bank made money by saying yes. The bank lost nothing by being wrong. Verification wasn't just skipped. There was no one left in the chain whose job it was to doubt you. And on the unemployment side, the CARES Act did something new. Pandemic unemployment assistance opened benefits to the self-employed, gig workers, freelancers, independent contractors, people with no employer on file. A humane idea. Also, in practice, no employer to call, no payroll record to match. A claim was a name, a social security number, and a story. States drowning in real claims processed them in bulk and mailed out benefits loaded onto debit cards. Stolen identities went in. Debit cards came out. By the mailbox full. The current head of the Small Business Administration describing what her agency later found. Hundreds of millions of dollars had gone out to applicants listed as more than 115 years old.
Date. We require citizenship checks. We know that during the pandemic, hundreds of millions went out to people over the age of 115 years old. So it's guardrails are on.
The vault wasn't cracked. It was propped open, on purpose, in an emergency, with a sign that said, "Take what you need. Be honest." Word travels fast when money is free. Miami. David T. Hines, 29 years old, runs a moving business. In the spring of 2020, he submits PPP applications for 4 companies, claiming millions in monthly payroll. Payroll that, he later admitted in federal court, didn't exist. Total asked $13.5 million. $3.9 million approved. And within days, David Hines walks into a dealership and buys a $318,000 Lamborghini Huracan. That detail matters, not because of the car, but because of what it tells you about fear. He wasn't afraid. He didn't launder anything. He put the loan money and the supercar purchase through accounts in his own name, and in the weeks that followed, prosecutors said, the money went to dating websites, jewelry, and luxury hotels in Miami Beach. When agents arrested him, they seized the Lamborghini and $3.4 million still sitting in the accounts. He pleaded guilty. 6 years and 3 months in federal prison. And his case, one of the very first, became the template for a category the Justice Department would come to know intimately: the loud ones. Orange County, California, Mustafa Kadiri, $5 million across fraudulent applications, some filed using a stolen identity. He pleaded guilty to bank fraud, aggravated identity theft, money laundering, a Ferrari, a Bentley, a Lamborghini. All of it seized, 4.5 years in federal prison, nearly $3 million in restitution. Cases like these were prosecuted by the hundreds. The fraud itself happened by the hundreds of thousands. And here's what the parade tells you about the design. These men were caught because they were loud. A 29-year-old with no income history buying a Huracan in cash is a red flag a bank robot can find. The quiet ones, the ones who took $50,000 for a landscaping business that didn't exist, paid off a mortgage, and told no one, mostly just kept it. Because the enforcement math was upside down. The program approved more than 11 million loans. Set every investigator working these cases against that number, and the odds of any single quiet file ever being opened were, for a while, close to zero. And everyone applying could feel it. The Justice Department's own math makes the point. In these programs, being caught was the exception. By the Inspector General's estimate, 17% of everything that went out the door, more than $200 billion, shows the marks of fraud. The recovered portion? We'll get to that number. You won't like it. Everything you've seen so far was opportunism. What happened in Minnesota was something else. It was infrastructure. During the pandemic, the federal government paid to keep feeding children who could no longer eat at school. The money flowed through state agencies to local nonprofits called sponsors. One of them, in Minneapolis, was named Feeding Our Future. Before the pandemic, Feeding Our Future was a small sponsor handling modest sums. Then the emergency rules arrived, the same trade as everywhere else. Feed kids now, verify later. Sites in its network began enrolling, and within days or weeks of being formed, brand new sites were reporting that they were feeding thousands of children, a day, each. By the time it was over, the network had claimed 91 million meals. 91 million. Federal reimbursements followed the paperwork, nearly $250 million. The meals, in overwhelming part, did not exist. At trial, prosecutors walked the jury through attendance rosters listing the names and ages of children, invented names, invented ages, documents built to be skimmed, never read. The money, they proved, went where this story always goes: real estate, cars, jewelry, and out through a web of shell companies to the people running the sites. And here is the detail that separates Minnesota from every Lamborghini case you just watched. The system actually noticed. In late 2020, the Minnesota Department of Education, the agency writing the checks, flagged the impossible growth and tried to slow the payments down. Amy Bach didn't run, she sued them, accusing the state of discriminating against the East African community her site served, and the payments kept flowing. Think about what that means. The alarm worked. A state agency looked at a food charity growing like a tech startup and said, "This is impossible." And the response to the alarm was a lawsuit, and the alarm was switched off, and the money kept moving for another year. When the FBI finally executed its raids in January 2022, the case would swallow the district. Dozens of defendants, waves of trials, guilty pleas stacking year after year. A federal judge has since ordered millions forfeited from the operation's accounts, a fraction chasing a flood. Federal prosecutors called it the largest pandemic relief fraud scheme in the country. More than 70 people indicted, 66 convicted so far. And this operation defended itself like an operation. In June 2024, during the first trial, 7 defendants. Someone followed a juror home. A bag containing $120,000 in cash handed to a relative at Juror 52's front door, with a promise of more for a not guilty vote. She reported it immediately. The judge sequestered the jury. The FBI opened a second case. 5 more people were charged, and the bribery convictions began stacking on top of the fraud ones. They stole from a program that feeds children, and when the system finally reached them, they tried to buy the jury. That is not a loophole story anymore. That is what the open vault grew into, given 2 years. The founder, Amy Bach, went to trial in 2025, still insisting she had been deceived by everyone around her. The jury deliberated 5 hours. Guilty on every count. Her co-defendant, who ran one of the largest sites, guilty on all 21 of his.
In federal funds meant to feed underprivileged children has now been sentenced to 41.5 years in prison. So Amy Bach, who ran Feeding Our Future, was sentenced Thursday in federal.
So, how much was actually stolen? Here is the uncomfortable answer. The United States government does not know. And the argument about it is itself part of this story. The Inspector General who audited the loan programs put likely fraud above $200 billion, roughly $1 of every 6 that went out. The agency he audited fired back that his method wildly overcounted and put the figure at $36 billion, with most of it, they said, concentrated in the chaos of 2020. That's not a rounding disagreement. That's a $170 billion argument about how big the crime scene is, between the auditor and the audited, inside the same building. Add the Government Accountability Office's estimate for pandemic unemployment fraud, somewhere between 100 and 135 billion, and at least 19 separate federal programs with confirmed fraud, and the plausible total crosses $300 billion. Some totals run higher. And the recovery? Of the roughly $400 billion loss picture, the government has clawed back less than 1%. Not because no one cares, because arithmetic. Millions of suspicious loans, thousands of prosecutors, a justice system built to try crimes one defendant at a time, pointed at a crime committed by, statistically speaking, a small city's worth of people. Congress did one thing that changes the ending of this story. In August 2022, it extended the statute of lathymatic on this fraud from 5 years to 10. Nearly unanimous, both parties. which means every fraudulent application filed in 2020 and 2021 stays prosecutable into 2030 and beyond. The race isn't over. It was barely starting. Which brings us to right now. In 2026, the Small Business Administration turned its pandemic portfolio into a manhunt, a task force. More than 550 enforcement actions in its first 60 days, by the agency's own count. 562,000 suspected fraudulent loans referred to the Treasury for collection. $22 billion. State by state, Ohio alone. 27,000 borrowers suspended in a single announcement, alongside 4 fresh indictments worth barely $1 million each. The agency's own message with those small cases was explicit. No amount of fraud is too small to come back for. And the agency quietly admitted something else. In the administrator's words, for the first time in its history, it now checks an applicant's date of birth and citizenship, requirements you probably assumed existed. In 2020, they didn't. And in July 2026, this month as this film is being finished, the agency announced it was expanding its use of Palantir software to hunt the rest. The same class of data tools built to track terror networks now pointed at loan applications from 2020. The math of the manhunt is simple. The haystack is enormous, but for the first time, the needle finder is a machine, and the clock doesn't run out until the next decade. As for the biggest case of them all, on May 21, 2026, 2 months ago, Judge Nancy Brassel sentenced Amy Bach to 500 months in federal prison, 41 years, and ordered her to repay $242 million.
News also coming out of the U.S. District Courthouse in Minneapolis. A judge today sentenced Amy Bach to more than 41 years in prison. She was the founder and executive director of Feeding Our Future and the ringleader of the biggest scheme, Minnesota.
41 years for a woman who ran a nonprofit with the word future in its name. Within weeks, she filed her appeal. So even the biggest case of the era is, as of this month, not finished. Nothing about this story is finished. The easiest heist in American history didn't need a tunnel, or a getaway driver, or a single gun. It needed a crisis, a wire transfer, and an honor system. The money is mostly gone. The applications aren't. They're sitting in federal databases, millions of them, each one a signed confession or an honest plea, waiting for a machine or a prosecutor or a decade to tell the difference. Somewhere in that pile is an application filed 6 years ago by someone who has spent every day since, waiting for a knock. If their name comes up, you'll probably hear about it here.